And you've been listening to State Department spokesperson Ned Price there with its stance on the rising border tensions between Ukraine and Russia. Let's bring in former DHS official under President Trump and ABC News contributor Elizabeth Newman, also ABC News political director Rick Klein, and also ABC News State Department reporter Connor Finnegan for more on everything that we've just heard. Rick, we really didn't hear anything new, but just talking about the likelihood here that Russia may actually invade Ukraine. What sort of consequences would a military offensive have on diplomatic relations with the West here, and just the likelihood of an invasion? I mean, this is, as pointed out, this is just part of the Russia playbook. We have definitely seen this before.
Yeah, and this is a major moment, a major test for President Biden about a year into his tenure. The biggest provocation we've seen to date from the Russian President Vladimir Putin on an issue, frankly, when you say the word Russia in Washington, it automatically brings a certain political charge around it. And we remember the high-stakes meeting over the summer between Biden and Putin. And now you have a situation where President Biden is going to be tested on the world stage. No one's really backing down from the stakes of tomorrow's video conference. We know what U.S. intelligence believes to be Putin's intentions. We know what he's done in the past on Ukraine. We know the way that he seems to poke and prod and often provoke American presidents. This appears to be much in line with that, but the range of options that the American side has here is pretty limited, and Putin knows that, and I think is taking advantage also of a president who's a little bit wounded domestically, knows that he's not at his political high point, and is trying to achieve geopolitical goals that have been a goal of his for quite some time.
And Elizabeth, State Department spokesman that we were just listening to, Ned Price, did say that in the event of military action across that border by Russian forces, he said the United States would be able and ready to respond resolutely. He said with measures that have not been used in the past. We haven't used them, he said, because of the impact that they might have. And a senior administration official briefing reporters said that in the event of an invasion, the need to reinforce the confidence and reassurance of our NATO allies and Eastern flank allies, that means Ukraine, the United States would be prepared to provide that kind of reassurance. So translate for us, if Russia invades, does that mean war with NATO?
Oh man, that's a tough thing to interpret or read the tea leaves. What we know is that there is definitely a lot of conversation happening in Washington right now to look at all of those potential tools. The illusions that we were hearing implied some pretty hefty economic consequences if they're actually implemented. And you know, when you're looking at whether or not we lean into the potential of military action, that's going to have to be something that NATO as a group would decide to do. I don't think the U.S. would go at it alone, but certainly given what happened in 2014, it would be wise for us to make sure that we don't overpromise and then not follow through with whatever we commit to doing, because Putin keeps learning he can take as much as he can and get away with it because the U.S. in the past has not stood up to him.
And as Russian troops build up near Russia's borders there with Ukraine, our Ian Panell in country for us right now. Ian, just bring us up to date, what you're seeing, what you're hearing at this moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty astonishing to be here on the ground. It's almost like going back in time and witnessing some kind of Cold War standoff. And in some senses, we're still seeing the ripple effects at the end of the Cold War. We were down towards the front line earlier, and there you have thousands of Ukrainian troops, almost toe-to-toe, really, with thousands of Russian-backed separatist forces. Remember, back in 2014 into 2015, Russia assisted these rebel forces to take over the east of the country. And ever since then, there's been a very fragile peace, but one that's really involved artillery shells being exchanged. Even today, every few minutes, you can hear the sound of small arms fire. We spoke to one Ukrainian lieutenant colonel who was telling us that artillery shells are exchanged, that he constantly is seeing some of his men being injured or even killed, and the same goes for the other side as well. So this conflict, although it technically ended, is still rumbling on, and this is now the epicenter. What U.S. officials have been saying, and Ukrainian officials, is that there are as many as 100,000 Russian forces now poised on the Ukrainian-Russian border, and that Russia plans to add even more. Now, they're not emphatic to the point saying that Vladimir Putin will invade, but they're saying they're seeing all the signs that they are preparing to invade, potentially as early as next year. I think the real question here is, what is Vladimir Putin's game? And even hardened Kremlinologists who've been looking at this for years are divided on exactly what he's doing. Does he really want to take over the east of the country? He's clearly very concerned at what he sees as Ukraine's increasing move to the west, towards NATO, increased involvement of American and other NATO forces supplying defensive equipment, sometimes offensive equipment. The colonel we spoke to today said he'd seen an increase in American support for his troops on the front line. That's what bothers the Kremlin. They see this as their sphere of influence. Vladimir Putin said very clearly this is the red line that the West cannot cross, and that's why he's applying pressure. Is it a high-stakes gamble? Is this brinkmanship, or does he really intend to go across the border? A lot hangs on this conversation tomorrow.
And as you say, and he is a man to read. I was there in 2014 when those little green men and forces without any insignia on their vehicles, on their armor, or on their uniforms, so he couldn't really pin them directly that way on Russia, moved in, and that's where it's been since. And that conflict taken 14,000 lives so far. Karna, let me ask you about what tools the United States does have, because the senior administration official who spoke to reporters today did say the United States is not seeking to end up in a circumstance which the focus of our countermeasures is the direct use of American force. So what else? Elizabeth talked a little bit about it. What else is in the toolbox?
Hey, yeah, that's right. You know, the most important thing I think in the toolbox right now are those economic penalties for Russia. Last week, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that there would be high-impact economic measures, things that the U.S. has held off on using so far in this conflict in the last 7 years. I think top among them, what some officials describe as sort of the nuclear option, is to cut Russia off from SWIFT. SWIFT is the financial transaction system that basically all of the world's banks use to move money around. And if Russia was cut off from SWIFT, it would, essentially halt a lot of money flowing in. Money that Russia earns from its oil and natural gas reserves, which are really the backbone of the Russian economy. That is, again, seen as sort of the most intense thing that the U.S. could do. And Russia has been preparing for something like that for the last few years to try to protect their own economic system. In addition to that, there could be more sanctions on President Putin's inner circle, folks close to him, certain oligarchs, and their energy sector, their natural gas and their oil, and certain individual banks within the Russian economy. The question with all of that is that these sanctions, these economic penalties, have not had an effect in recent years. They have not removed Russian forces from Crimea, the peninsula that Russia invaded and annexed in 2014. We haven't seen Russian troops, pull out their support for Ukrainian separatists in the eastern provinces. So why would these penalties make a difference now? It's the scale of them, I think, that would really perhaps change President Putin's calculus. And again, the Biden administration is hoping that the threat of these sanctions now will be enough to prevent Putin from making this decision to invade Ukraine in a full-scale invasion.
Ian, this is clearly different than the buildup that we saw in the spring. Just put into perspective how much more concerning this is, and why now?
Yeah, I think it is much more concerning. Every analyst who's looked at this, it's not just the numbers, but the way that the troops have operated, the way that they've positioned themselves on the ground, makes it look, certainly for intelligence analysts, much more like a potential invasion, and that's why they're much more concerned. I mean, it's interesting talking to people here. Terry was talking about these separatists, many of whom appeared to have come from across the border in Russia. The first checkpoint that was set up by the rebels was in this town here. We were just speaking to someone earlier who said he was stopped at this checkpoint. He asked the people where they were from, and he realized that their accents weren't local. They were Russian accents. I think the fear is that this time it could be much more serious. But also Ukrainians have had to live with this reality for almost 8 years, and many of them are just tired of this conflict. They don't trust the promises that they've heard from politicians, the promises of peace agreements, of deals, of the Minsk agreements, the revised Minsk alliance agreement. So they're really going to vote with their feet. Interestingly, one of the key searches that seemed to peak on Google in Ukraine today was grab bag. Well, anyone who's looked at these kind of scenarios knows a grab bag is something you get in an emergency to leave your home. So people are concerned here, but nevertheless, they're going to wait and see what the writing turns out to be, whether Vladimir Putin is serious, whether he's going to go across the border, or whether this is just a very strongly worded threat.
Ian, the view from the ground there. And one more to Rick. President Biden mired in sagging polls, having a lot of trouble getting his agenda through the Democratic Party, much less Republicans. It would seem that an international crisis of this nature is the last thing this president needs.
Yeah, and you can't imagine that, that President Putin is not aware of that. And in choosing the timing here, recognizing that you've got a president, an American president, who's a bit weakened by his standing in the polls, by the stalling of his domestic agenda, dealing with other international crises, even the same day that they're announcing a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics. A lot on President Biden's plate. And clearly this White House, in building up to tomorrow's conversation, is letting everyone know that this is going to be a pretty stark conversation, as realistic a conversation as possible between two presidents separated so much by ideology as well as geography. President Biden, the Biden White House, recognizing that they're being tested and that this is one of those situations that a U.S. president just can't fail.
All right, Elizabeth, Rick, Connor, Ian, thank you all so much.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.